Marcus sat quietly in the corner of the small airport terminal. He was only 12, but he carried himself with a calm, polite manner in his hands. He held a small model airplane, running his fingers over its smooth wings. His backpack rested. On the seat beside him, worn but clean, with a keychain shaped like a jet hanging from the zipper, he was waiting for his father. Just like he had been told, the terminal was busy. But Marcus kept to himself. He didn't run around or make noise. He simply watched the planes land and take off through the large glass windows. His eyes sparkled with curiosity. One day, he dreamed of becoming a pilot, just like the ones walking past in crisp uniforms. That was when a man in a captain's uniform stopped and looked at him. The man's eyes narrowed as he took in Marcus's dark skin, his simple clothes, and the fact that he was sitting alone without saying a word to Marcus. The pilot pulled out his phone. He stepped a few feet away, his voice low but sharp as he spoke to someone. Marcus didn't hear everything, but he caught the words suspicious and possible security threat. A few minutes later, 2 airport security officers walked into the terminal. Their eyes locked on Marcus. One of them pointed at him, and the other approached with a serious look. "Stand up, kid," one officer said. Marcus blinked. Confused? Why? "Just stand up," the officer repeated, his voice firm. People in the terminal began to watch, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Marcus slowly got to his feet, holding his toy airplane tightly. The officer reached for his backpack. "What's inside?" "My school stuff," Marcus replied quietly. The officer unzipped the bag and dumped the contents onto the nearby seat. Out fell a science book, a pencil case, a sandwich wrapped in foil, and a folded invitation. The officer picked up the invitation and read it. It was from the National Aviation Youth Program, inviting Marcus to attend an exclusive event. Still, the officer frowned, as if the paper meant nothing. The pilot who had called them over walked closer, arms folded. This boy was hanging around the gate for too long, he said loudly so everyone could hear. "I've seen this before. Sometimes they're scouting for weaknesses." Marcus's cheeks burned with embarrassment. "I'm just waiting for my dad," he said again, but no one seemed to care. An elderly woman sitting nearby stood up. "Leave the child alone," she said sharply. "He's not doing anything wrong." One of the officers told her to sit down and stay out of it. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't move. The other passengers kept watching, some shaking their heads, others whispering to each other. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He felt like the whole room was against him. He wished his father would walk in right now and take him away from all of this, but for the moment, he stood there, holding his toy airplane like it was the only thing keeping him together. The officers kept questioning him, asking where he came from, why he was here, and who his father was. Marcus answered every question politely, but his voice trembled. The pilot smirked, clearly thinking he had done the right thing. Passengers began to take out their phones, some filming, sensing that something wasn't right. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an hour to Marcus. The officers finally told him to sit back down, but stayed nearby, watching him closely. Marcus sat on the edge of the chair, his hands gripping the toy plane. His eyes kept darting toward the terminal entrance. Hoping to see a familiar face, the pilot paced nearby. Still acting like he had stopped some dangerous situation, the elderly woman kept her eyes on Marcus. Her expression soft, but angry at the same time, and in the distance. Footsteps echoed against the polished floor. Someone was coming, and the entire mood of the room was about to change. Marcus sat back down, but it didn't feel like a seat anymore. It felt like a stage, with dozens of eyes watching him as if he was some kind of show. Every time he looked up, he saw strangers staring, whispering, and glancing at the officers still standing nearby. His toy airplane rested in his lap, but even that small comfort now felt heavy in his hands. The pilot stood a few feet away, arms still crossed over his chest. He wore a smug expression, the kind people have when they think they've done something heroic. In his mind, Marcus was already guilty, no trial. No proof, just guilt. The two security officers stayed alert, their eyes scanning Marcus's every movement as if he might suddenly explode into trouble. A young couple sitting across the aisle whispered to each other. The woman looked concerned, but the man shrugged, as if saying, "Better safe than sorry." Those words hurt Marcus without even hearing them. It was the way people looked at him, like he was dangerous just because of how he looked and where he was sitting. One of the officers picked up Marcus's sandwich from the seat. "What's this?" he asked, his tone as if it were some strange object. "My lunch," Marcus answered quietly. The officer gave a half smirk, as if the idea of a kid carrying his own food was somehow suspicious. The old woman who had spoken earlier frowned deeply, muttering something under her breath. The pilot stepped closer and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You can't be too careful these days," he said. "Kids hanging around restricted areas could be checking for weak spots." Marcus's hands tightened around his toy airplane until his knuckles turned white. He wanted to speak up, to defend himself, but every time he tried, his voice caught in his throat. A small boy sitting with his mother nearby pointed at Marcus and whispered, "Mom, what's happening?" The mother leaned down and whispered back. But Marcus could still see the way her eyes flicked toward him. It wasn't curiosity, it was fear. That fear felt like a shadow pressing down on him. He didn't understand how just sitting in a chair could make people afraid of him. The old woman finally stood again. "This is nonsense," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "This boy hasn't done a thing wrong, and you're treating him like a criminal." The officer nearest to her turned, "Ma'am, please sit down or we'll have to remove you from the area." The crowd gasped at the threat, but no one else dared to speak up. Marcus's throat felt tight, his eyes burning. He blinked rapidly. Refusing to let the tears fall, the pilot glanced at his watch as if bored, tapping his foot impatiently. One of the officers pulled out a small notepad and started writing something down. Marcus didn't know what, but it made his stomach twist. A man in a business suit walked past, slowing when he saw the scene. He glanced at Marcus, then at the pilot, then at the officers. For a second, it looked like he might say something, but then he kept walking. That was the worst part, watching grown-ups see something unfair and choose to do nothing. The air in the terminal felt heavier by the minute. Marcus sat still, afraid that any movement might be taken the wrong way. The officer, with the notepad, asked for his full name, his address, and his father's name. Marcus answered quietly, his voice trembling. The moment he said his father's name, James Carter, one of the officers raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. The pilot muttered something to the officer, and they both chuckled softly. Marcus felt heat rise to his cheeks. It was like they weren't just questioning him. They were laughing at him. The humiliation was worse than the fear. It was the feeling of being made small in front of so many people. Passengers kept glancing at him, some with pity, some with suspicion. The old woman shook her head slowly, her eyes full of quiet rage. Marcus's heart pounded so hard he thought everyone could hear it. He gripped his airplane tighter, as if holding on to a piece of his dream could keep him from breaking. Then, just when the officers seemed ready to take him somewhere else, a deep, steady voice echoed from the entrance of the terminal. It was a voice that carried authority, the kind that made people turn their heads instantly. Marcus froze, his heart skipping a beat. He knew that voice. He turned toward the sound. And there, walking into the terminal with calm but powerful steps, was his father. And in that moment, the entire energy in the room began to shift. The steady sound of footsteps echoed through the terminal. Each step seemed to grow louder, not just in volume, but in presence. Passengers who had been pretending not to watch the scene now turned their heads fully. Some straightened in their Seats, sensing something important was about to happen. Marcus's eyes widened the moment he saw him. A tall man in a dark, perfectly pressed suit walked in with a kind of calm confidence that made the air feel different. His shoulders were broad, his stride even, and his gaze sharp as it swept across the room. People didn't need to know who he was to realize. This was not someone to underestimate. The man walked straight toward Marcus, his expression unreadable. The officers noticed him but didn't move. The pilot, however, frowned slightly. Something about the man's presence seemed to rattle him, though he tried to hide it. When the man reached Marcus, he didn't say anything to the officers first. He knelt down to his son's level. His voice softened, though it still carried weight. "Are you all right, Marcus?" Marcus's lips trembled, but he nodded, gripping his toy airplane tightly. A flicker of relief crossed the man's face. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by quiet steel. Standing. The man turned toward the officers. "What exactly is happening here?" he asked, his tone low but firm. One officer cleared his throat. "This boy was sitting here alone for an extended period, sir," he began. "We were informed it could be a security concern." The man's eyes moved to the pilot, who now shifted uncomfortably under the gaze. "You informed them," the man said, his voice not rising, but somehow making the entire terminal fall silent. The pilot straightened his shoulders, trying to hold his ground. "Yes," he replied. "He was hanging around restricted areas, and I wasn't going to take chances." Marcus quickly shook his head. "I was sitting right here, Dad," he said quietly. The old woman from before nodded firmly. "He hasn't moved from that seat since I first saw him." The man's jaw tightened. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black leather wallet. From it, he slid an identification card and held it up for everyone to see. The gold letters and seal caught the light. Federal Aviation Administration Director. James Carter gasps rippled through the crowd. A few passengers whispered in disbelief. Even the officers froze for a moment, glancing at each other before looking back at him. The pilot's face paled. I didn't know," he began, but Carter cut him off. "You didn't need to know who I was," he said sharply. "You needed to treat my son with basic respect." His voice was calm, but carried an edge that made even the bystanders feel its weight. The pilot swallowed hard, glancing around as if looking for support. But the crowd had turned. Eyes that had once been neutral now watched him with disapproval. The old woman smirked slightly, as if satisfied justice was finally stepping in. Carter turned back to the officers. "Were there any complaints other than the pilot's?" The officers exchanged a quick glance. Then one of them said, "No, sir." Carter's brow furrowed. "So this entire situation," he said slowly, "was based on one man's assumption." Neither officer answered. Silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant hum of airport announcements. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, wishing the moment would be over, but also feeling a spark of pride that his father was here. Carter crouched again to look Marcus in the eye. "You did nothing wrong," he said firmly, his voice louder this time so everyone could hear. Marcus nodded, his lips pressing together to keep from crying. Carter straightened and looked directly at the pilot. "You will regret this," he said, not as a threat, but as a promise. The tension in the air was thick enough to feel. The pilot tried to speak again. "You were just wrong." Carter interrupted, and with that, the balance of power in the room shifted completely. Passengers who had been silent now began to murmur loudly. A few even clapped. Softly, the old woman smiled at Marcus, giving him a reassuring nod. The officers stepped back slightly, their posture less aggressive, but the confrontation wasn't over. Carter had more to say, and his next words would make sure no one in that terminal would forget this day. The terminal had gone silent again. Every eye was locked on Director James Carter. Even the background noise of rolling suitcases and distant boarding calls seemed quieter. It was as if the airport itself was holding its breath. Carter stood tall, his eyes fixed on the pilot. "I want to understand something," he began, his voice steady and controlled. "You saw a boy sitting quietly holding a toy airplane, waiting for his father. And your first thought was to call the police." The words weren't shouted, but they carried like thunder through the room. The pilot shifted uncomfortably. "I thought wrong." Carter cut in sharply. "You didn't speak to him. You didn't ask a question. You didn't even consider that he might belong here." He took a slow step forward, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "You judged him, and you decided he was a threat." Because of how he looked, a few passengers murmured their agreement. The old woman who had defended Marcus earlier raised her chin in silent support. The pilot opened his mouth to respond, but Carter was already reaching into his jacket again. He pulled out a small black leather case and flipped it open for everyone to see. The gold emblem gleamed under the terminal lights, the official seal of the Federal Aviation Administration. "My name is James Carter," he said, his voice now carrying the weight of authority. "I am the director of the FAA." Gasps moved through the crowd like a wave. A few people pulled out their phones to record. Realizing they were witnessing something unforgettable, the pilot's face turned pale. "I didn't know you didn't need to know," Carter interrupted, his voice like a blade. "You should treat every passenger, every person, with respect. Whether they are the child of the FAA director or a janitor cleaning these floors." The officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence now gone. Carter's gaze moved to them. "And you," he said, "didn't even verify the complaint before acting on it." One of the officers cleared his throat. We were following standard procedure, sir." Carter's voice hardened. "Your procedure should begin with judgment, fairness, and facts, not bias." The tension in the terminal was so thick, it felt like no one dared to move. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, hanging onto every word. The old woman nodded approvingly, her lips curling into a faint smile. Even Marcus sat straighter, his grip on his toy airplane loosening just a little. Carter then took a slow breath, his voice dropping into something quieter but more dangerous. "You didn't just embarrass my son," he said to the pilot. "You humiliated him. You made him feel unsafe. You made him feel small in an airport that should welcome people from every walk of life." His words struck like a hammer. Leaving the pilot without a single defense, the pilot finally lowered his eyes, his arrogance shattered. He mumbled, "I'm sorry." But the words were weak, hollow. Carter's jaw tightened. "Apologies don't erase the harm you've done," he replied. "They don't erase the lesson my son has just learned, that people will look at his skin before they look at his character." The crowd was no longer just watching. They were on Carter's side. A man in a business suit stood and said loudly, "He's right." Another passenger nodded. "That kid did nothing wrong." The murmur of voices grew until the sound filled the room. The pilot tried again. "I was just following safety protocol." "No," Carter said firmly. "You were following prejudice." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. The pilot had no comeback, only silence. Marcus looked up at his father, a small flicker of pride breaking through the lingering fear. Carter put a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. Then he turned to the officers. "I want your names, both of you." The officers exchanged nervous glances before slowly giving. Then Carter pulled out a notepad from his jacket and wrote them down. "This will be reported," he said flatly. The pilot opened his mouth one last time, but Carter raised a hand, stopping him. "I don't want excuses," he said. "I want change, and I will make sure it happens, by now." Nearly every passenger in the terminal was recording. The old woman smiled warmly at Marcus. Mouthing the words, "You're safe now," Marcus gave a tiny nod in return. Carter glanced once more at the pilot, his expression unreadable. "This conversation isn't over," he said quietly, almost like a warning. Then, turning back to his son, his voice softened again. "Come on, Marcus, let's go." The two began walking toward the exit. The crowd parted for them without a word. The sound of their footsteps echoed once again, but this time they carried victory, not tension. And as they left the terminal, the pilot stood frozen in place, every eye still on him. Every camera still pointed his way. He had no idea how badly this moment would follow him in the days to come. James, Carter, and Marcus had almost reached the sliding doors of the terminal when a voice called out behind them, "Sir, please wait." It was one of the security officers, jogging to catch up, his face pale and unsure. Passengers were still, filming, their cameras following every movement. The air inside the terminal was heavy, the kind of weight that comes before a storm. Carter turned slowly, his eyes sharp. The officer hesitated before speaking. "The airport duty manager is on the way. They want to discuss the situation." Marcus looked up at his father, but Carter gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "All right," he said. "Let's hear what they have to say." They walked back toward the waiting area. The pilot was still there, standing stiffly. His arms no longer crossed. Instead, they hung awkwardly by his sides. His face was pale, and he kept glancing toward the arriving manager as if hoping for backup. The old woman remained in her seat, watching, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been proven right. The duty manager, a middle-aged man with a polished badge and a tense smile, hurried over. "Director Carter, I've been briefed," he began. "I'm deeply sorry for this misunderstanding." "This wasn't a misunderstanding," Carter interrupted, his voice cold. "This was profiling, pure and simple." The manager's smile faltered. Passengers nearby nodded in agreement, some murmuring their approval of Carter's words. The pilot's jaw tightened, and he finally spoke up. "I acted to protect everyone here." Carter's eyes locked on him. "You acted to protect your own prejudice," he said firmly. "You assumed my son was a threat without reason, without evidence, and without even speaking to him." The pilot's voice rose slightly. "With all due respect, I've been a pilot for 20 years. I've seen enough to know when something doesn't look right." "And in all that time," Carter said, stepping closer, "how many times have you been wrong?" The pilot's mouth opened, then closed. He had no answer. The manager tried to step in. "Perhaps we should move this to a private area." "No," Carter said sharply, his voice carrying through the terminal. "This conversation stays right here, where it started, in front of the people who watched it happen." A small cheer went up from a few passengers, and phones continued recording. Carter's tone grew heavier. "My son will grow up knowing how to fly before he can even drive. He's been inside more cockpits than most trainee pilots." He glanced toward Marcus, who stood quietly, but with his head a little higher now. "And yet today, he was treated like a criminal in an airport he's visited dozens of times." The pilot shifted his weight uncomfortably. The old woman leaned forward, calling out, "We all saw it, Director." The boy was just sitting there. Carter nodded toward her. "And yet, that didn't matter to him," he said, pointing to the pilot. What mattered was his own assumption, and that assumption led to public humiliation for a child. The manager exhaled slowly, clearly struggling to control the damage. "Director Carter, I will personally ensure that this is investigated." "You'll ensure more than that," Carter said. "You'll ensure my son gets a public apology right here and now from the man who called the police on him." The pilot's eyes widened. I think it's better if we know," Carter said, cutting him off again. "Do it now." For a long, tense moment, the pilot said nothing. All around them, the passengers leaned in, their eyes fixed on him. Finally, with a deep, reluctant breath, he turned to Marcus. His voice was stiff, his words forced. "I'm sorry, I misjudged you." Marcus didn't say anything, just stared at the floor. Carter spoke for him. "An apology is only the first step. Change your thinking before you do this to someone else." The pilot nodded slightly, though his eyes still held frustration. The manager promised again that the matter would be reviewed. Carter took Marcus's hand, ready to leave for good this time, but before stepping away, he turned back one last time to the pilot. "Remember this moment," he said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear, "because the next time you judge someone without reason, you might not be lucky enough for it to end with words." The pilot swallowed hard. The passengers began clapping again, this time louder. The old woman stood and gave Marcus a proud smile. Marcus smiled back, small but real, as he walked beside his father toward the exit, and though the confrontation was over, the pilot could still feel the weight of every camera pointed at him. He knew this day, and his humiliation was far from forgotten by the next morning. The video was everywhere. Clips from the terminal, recorded on shaky phone cameras, had flooded social media overnight. Millions had already seen the moment. When James Carter revealed who he was, millions had also seen Marcus, a boy standing quietly, clutching a toy airplane while uniformed officers loomed over him. Comments poured in from people all over the country. Some were angry, others heartbroken. Many said they saw their own children in Marcus. News channels picked up the story, replaying the footage again and again. Every replay showed the pilot's face, pale, stiff, and clearly uncomfortable. At the small regional airport, the atmosphere was tense. The pilot hadn't flown that morning. Instead, he was in the manager's office, listening as his supervisor read out the official statement from the airline. They were calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding but promising full cooperation with the FAA review. The words felt empty even to the manager, but they were the safest ones the company could use. "You need to make a public apology," the manager said. "Not just for the FAA, but for the court of public opinion, and right now, that court is tearing you apart." The pilot's jaw tightened. "I've already apologized to the boy," he muttered. "That was in front of maybe 50 people," the manager said sharply. "Now the whole world is watching." That afternoon, James Carter received a formal request from the airport's management. They wanted him and Marcus to attend a press briefing where the pilot would apologize publicly. Carter agreed, but only under one condition: Marcus would not be put under pressure to speak. "This isn't about forcing my son to perform for cameras," Carter said. "This is about holding an adult accountable." The next day, the press conference was set up in the same terminal where the incident had happened. Chairs were arranged for reporters, cameras lined the back wall, and microphones waited on a table at the front. Passengers who remembered the scene gathered at the edges, curious to see how it would unfold. When Carter and Marcus entered, a low murmur swept through the room. Marcus wore a clean button-down shirt and still carried his toy airplane. He stayed close to his father, looking around but avoiding eye contact with the cameras. The pilot was already there. Gone was the confident, folded-arm stance he'd had 2 days ago. Now his shoulders slumped slightly, his uniform looked less crisp, and his eyes darted nervously between the reporters and Carter. The airport manager stepped to the microphone first. "We are here today to address the incident that occurred 2 days ago," he said. "We deeply regret the distress caused to Marcus Carter and his family." He glanced at the pilot, then stepped aside. The pilot walked to the microphone slowly. For a moment, he just stood there, gripping the podium. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual. 2 days ago, I made a decision based on assumption, not fact," he began. "That decision caused a young boy to be questioned and embarrassed in front of strangers. And it was wrong." Carter stood beside Marcus, his face calm but unreadable. The pilot glanced at Marcus briefly before continuing. "I want to say directly to Marcus, I am sorry. Not just for what happened, but for why it happened." I saw someone who didn't look like they belonged. And instead of asking a simple question, I called security. His voice caught slightly. But whether from nerves or guilt, no one could tell. I have been a pilot for over 20 years. He continued, but in that moment, I forgot that my job isn't just to fly planes. It's to treat people with respect, fairness, and dignity. I failed to do that. There was a pause. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras clicked, and the crowd watched closely. Some faces looked skeptical, others thoughtful. The old woman from the terminal, who had come just to see this, nodded slowly. Marcus shifted his weight but said nothing. Carter's hand rested gently on his shoulder. The pilot took a deep breath and finished. I will be taking part in bias training and community outreach programs, and I will make sure this kind of mistake never happens again. When he stepped back, Carter moved forward to speak. I appreciate the apology, he said, his voice steady, but an apology is only as good as the change that follows it. This incident was about more than one boy and one pilot. It was about the assumptions we make and the harm they cause. He looked directly into the cameras, to the parents watching. To the people who've experienced something like this, you are seen and you are heard. And to those who haven't, think before you judge. The room was quiet for a moment before applause began. Some clapped politely, others more passionately. Marcus glanced up at his father and managed a small smile for him. It wasn't just about the apology, it was about knowing his father had stood up for him every step of the way. The press conference ended, but the story didn't fade. Clips of the pilot's apology spread almost as quickly as the original video. Some believed him, others didn't, but one thing was certain. His name and that moment were now part of a lesson people wouldn't forget. As Carter and Marcus left the terminal this time, the air felt lighter. And though Marcus still held his toy airplane, it no longer felt like something to hide behind. It felt like a reminder of the dream he a week had passed since the press conference. The storm online was beginning to calm, but the story had already left its mark for many. It had become more than just a news headline. It was a conversation starter. Schools used it to talk about prejudice, news panels debated it, and families discussed it at dinner tables. Marcus, however, had returned to his routine. But something inside him had changed. The fear from that day still sat in his memory. But so did the sight of his father, standing tall, unshaken, in front of everyone. It was a reminder that even when the world tried to make you small, you could stand your ground or have someone who loved you stand there for you. On Saturday morning, Carter surprised his son. "Get your jacket," he said with a small smile. Marcus tilted his head. "Where are we going?" "You'll see," Carter replied. They drove for nearly an hour before arriving at a large aviation training center. Marcus's eyes widened the moment he saw the hangars. Rows of sleek training jets sat on the tarmac, and the faint smell of fuel and engine oil filled the air. "This," Carter said, resting a hand on his son's shoulder, "is where dreams take flight." Inside, instructors greeted them warmly. Some had seen the video and quietly offered Carter a nod of respect. Carter led Marcus toward a simulator room, a full-scale replica of a cockpit, glowing with instruments and controls. Marcus stared at it as if he'd just stepped into another world. "You're going to learn something today," Carter said. "Not just how to fly, but how to know you belong anywhere you work hard to be." Marcus slid into the pilot's seat, his hands trembling slightly as he touched the controls. An instructor explained each switch, each gauge, and soon the simulator roared to life. For the next hour, Marcus flew through virtual skies. Every time the simulated plane tilted, his heart raced, not from fear, but from joy. When they finished, Carter knelt beside him. "You see this?" he said, pointing to the cockpit. "This doesn't care what you look like, where you come from, or who doubts you. It only cares if you're ready to take the controls." That afternoon, they walked along the runway. Jets took off one after Another, their engines shaking the ground. Carter spoke softly. What happened at the airport was wrong. And it hurt, but you need to remember, you didn't do anything wrong. The shame was never yours to carry. Marcus nodded. Slowly, for the first time. He felt like the fear from that day had loosened its grip. It would never fully disappear, but it would never control him again. Meanwhile, back at the airport, the pilot's life had shifted as well. The airline had put him on mandatory leave. He had begun the bias training he'd promised. And though many still doubted his sincerity, there were small signs that perhaps the experience had cracked open a space for change. Passengers noticed he now greeted everyone the same way, with a nod and a smile. No matter their age, skin color, or clothes. One afternoon, weeks later, Marcus and Carter were back at the same airport. This time, they were traveling together. For a father-son trip, they sat in the waiting area when a shadow fell across them. It was the pilot, in full uniform. He stopped a few feet away, cleared his throat, and said quietly, "Mr. Carter." Marcus Carter looked up calmly. "Yes?" The pilot shifted awkwardly. "I just wanted to say, I've been thinking about that day a lot," he said. "I've learned more in the last few weeks than I thought I would in years." He glanced at Marcus. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know, I'm trying to be better." Marcus didn't answer right away, but after a moment, he said softly, "I hope you do." The pilot nodded once and walked away. Carter watched him go, then turned to his son. "Sometimes," he said, "people change because they're forced to. But sometimes they change because someone stood up and made them see the truth." Marcus thought about that as their flight was called. He realized that his father hadn't just defended him, he had made the entire room, maybe even the world, see him differently. As they boarded, Marcus took a seat by the window. The engines roared to life, and the plane began to move. He held his toy airplane in one hand and looked out at the runway stretching ahead. One day he thought he wouldn't just be a passenger, he would be the one in the cockpit. And no one would ever doubt he belonged there. The wheels lifted from the ground, the sky opened wide before them. Endless and full of promise, and somewhere deep inside, Marcus knew this was the start of something bigger than one bad days to let anyone take from him.